All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, officially. This evening we are going to start the first of two lectures taking up written papers submitted by members of the class. These topics were chosen, I believe, the second and third week of the course, and the students had about 3 weeks to work out these papers, and then they were recopied and distributed to you, and we're going to do the first two this evening. We are concerned with them in part as examples of presentation of ideas in written form. We want to know about the methods of presentation, how they live up to or don't live up to the principles we discussed at the beginning pertaining to presentation of ideas and specifically written presentation. And also partly, of course, we're interested in the philosophic content as such. Are the points correctly presented? Are the essentials there? What can we learn about the topic? Because these are all important topics, so it's a twofold concern. Now, using both of those criteria, let us turn to the first paper, which is Manifestations of the Primacy of Consciousness. Now, where is the author of this paper who said he was? You're right in the front in the corner. This is Mr. Paul Cohen. Said that I could give permission to mention his name, and he's sitting right in the front here. Let's, at the very outset, you've had a chance to read it. Give me your impression using our typical 3-point vote system as essentially positive. In other words, even if there are some points you think you disagree with, but on the whole you think the presentation and content are good, or you think it's basically a mixed paper, there's a lot of good and some significant bad in it, or you think basically, even if there's a few good things here and there, it's off. Given a choice of those three, how many would say basically good? Well, you got, I would say, over half voted for basically good. How many would say mixed? It's a close second. Mixed is always pretty safe in a philosophy paper. I mean, on a certain level. And how many would say essentially negative? Very few people, and I would certainly not include myself in those who say this is essentially negative. In my opinion, I would be somewhere between the two biggest groups here. I'd either say high mixed or low good, so it would depend on how you would put it. What is, let's go into why now. On the overall, as a paper, what is good about this? Because there's a number of definitely good things before we start taking it one paragraph at a time. What on the overall is good about this? Raise your hands if you have an idea. Well, just one thing to begin with. Did you find it interesting to read? I think it was definitely an interesting paper, and that is an achievement on this topic, because such a title as The Primacy of Consciousness, Some Manifestations, that topic is a very heavy topic which could cause a creaking mental set to appear, and if you can read this and have your interest held, that is in itself a very good thing. What else? So I would say that's certainly one good thing about this. What is there about this paper which made it interesting and which held your attention now, regardless of whether there's errors? Yes?
Relevant.
You say relevant. In other words, you mean what? The type of examples he used? Well, then let's say, first of all, the ability to concretize, the use of concretes and examples is extremely critical in this type of paper. Why? Much more so than in the next paper. Why is it critical in this paper? Yes?
Because the topic is so abstract.
Because the topic is so extraordinarily abstract. Therefore, I would say at the outset, if you were doing the primacy of consciousness, it's virtually mandatory to give an example before you go into a discussion of it. If you give a definition first, no matter how lucid and limpid and simple your definition, it settles on the reader's mind like a weight because it's so enormously abstract. If you can give a good, colorful example first, which on top of it, as Ms. Powell suggested, is relevant and newsworthy, and yet paves the way for your abstraction, you have done wonders toward getting things started, because you've fulfilled two crucial things right off the bat. One is you motivate the reader because you intrigue him by something pertaining directly to the news and an important example. And second, you pave the way cognitively for his understanding because you give a concrete, so when you get to your abstraction, it's not so heavy. And therefore, the opener from that point of view is extremely good, with one possible qualification we'll get to in a moment. But that, and what else is an example of this same type of thing later in the paper, leaving aside now whether it's adequately done, but as an intention, what is an example of this same concretizing, motivating approach in the paper, later in the paper? Yes?
Follow through the examples.
Well, which examples in particular? There's one whole topic, which is really the whole, most of page 10. Yes? The antitrust laws. Now, there again is something that people know about. It's concrete. They can understand it. It's interesting. It's relevant. So it's on the same order as the opening. If he carried it out, there's a certain problem with the way he carried it out. But as an intention, the combination of that opening and that section on antitrust would certainly fulfill motivation and concretization. So the paper is good on those counts, leaving open now any possible questions about how it's done, how those are worked out. What about from the point of view of organization or structure? How would you evaluate this paper? Do you know where he is or where he's going at any given time? Or do you feel you don't know why he's taking the turns he's taking when? At the very back, yes.
So where it said when he went to the antitrust laws, from the example before, I don't know, it threw me for a loop for a second.
Well, you say when he went to the antitrust laws at the bottom of page 9, it threw you for a loop. Well, if it did, it can only be because of the way he worked out the example, because he explained it. His second last paragraph on page 9 is very clear. This principle dominates today, and so on. This can be seen in the sphere of action in which all human beings participate, the economy and the controls imposed on it. So he set you up there to say, I'm now going to discuss certain controls as an example of this broad principle. And then he says, consider the antitrust laws. So if you're talking simply structure, it's very clear why he's doing it and where he's going. I couldn't see why that would be confusing on a structural level. It wouldn't be as though he had omitted that second last paragraph on page 9 and just jumped without any transition. But here, I think his intention is clear. He's got an introduction, an example. Then the basic theory, what is the thing? Then another example worked out in some length. Then he concludes with the error, the alternative, and a sort of a wrap-up. So it's very clearly structured, purposefully written. I myself did not feel in reading it, I don't know where he's going, I don't know why he's covering this now, which is a very good thing about a paper. If you can have the sense in reading it, even if you don't agree with any given formulation, I know what he's talking about and why he's doing it at this point. That is already a great achievement, particularly in a heavy philosophy paper. I might say also it is well written. It's, the sentences are clear, even the ones that I think are false. I know what he's saying, what he's trying to say. It is not, it doesn't have the equivalent of legal boilerplate in it, you know, empty rhetoric or deliberately woozy space filling. He definitely has an idea that he wants to communicate with each sentence. So in all these ways, I would certainly say the paper is good. Does anybody want to say any overall good points in addition before we look at it a little more narrowly? Now, if I had to just say in advance on the negative before we get there more specifically, there is a certain confusion on the primacy of consciousness itself, on what that theory consists of, which causes trouble with parts of this paper, and that would be my main reason for giving a mixed verdict, is that there's a certain significant confusion on the content, on the topic being presented. But I want to show that as it comes along. Now let's go through it in order, making some comments as we go. I've already commented on what I think are the virtues of the opening. The only question I think you might ask, does anybody have any objection to that opening? It's conceivable to me that you could raise a certain objection, although I think the virtues are so good, as I've mentioned, but there is a certain possible objection. You have an objection, yes?
My objection to the opening was simply that it was so
I can't hear you.
The thinking behind the writing of the quote.
Well, you say Senator Kennedy's thinking was so confusing that it confused you.
Exactly, and I didn't know.
Well, I don't, if that were a valid objection, you could never start with an example of the primacy of consciousness, because it's, it's a clear example of the primacy of consciousness. Now, I had something somewhat different in mind that you could possibly object to. I wouldn't even insist on this, but I have heard this comment, so I'll pass it on to you. Pete, yeah.
Well, the thing that bothered me a little bit in the beginning was, if you wanted to illustrate the idea of primacy of consciousness, if you choose some horrible tragedy, it's kind of understandable that an emotional reaction immediately.
Yes. And you see, if you choose something, that's exactly the objection I heard. In fact, as worded, and given the full context of what you know about Kennedy, this is a good example of the primacy of consciousness. But, you know, since it is a horrible tragedy, it's a question of how literally does he actually mean it. Is he simply saying metaphorically, oh, God, I wish it hadn't happened? You see, no, I just uttered the words, oh, God, I wish it hadn't happened. Now, if you wanted to start a paper on religion, you see, you wouldn't say, Peikoff just had a tragedy and he just said, oh, God, I wish it hadn't happened, and that shows he's religious. In other words, is he speaking just loosely and in a manner of speaking in a tragedy, or does he mean it literally as a viewpoint? And most people would be inclined, I think, to think in a case like this, well, when he says, I hope and pray, it's just a loose way of speaking, and therefore you might put them off a bit. The best sentence, I think, of this whole quote from the aspect of stressing the primacy of consciousness is the one, I really willed it in my mind that she survived and really forced myself to believe that she had, because there is a little more than I wish it hadn't happened. He's actively trying to, you know, exercise his will to erase the fact. But leaving aside that, I could see why the temptation to use this would be irresistible. The only problem is this one, but we don't have to worry about that further. Now, then your next paragraph discusses that. I don't, just in passing, I don't believe you need, I don't fully know the purpose of the second sentence of the second paragraph. Is that a sort of a political dig in passing, or is that sentence, would you deal with the man? Or is that just a sort of a way of saying, you see, this is a certain kind of man and we now have to study him?
I use it sort of like a way to relate to the audience.
Oh, it's a way of relating to the audience, but you see, by saying, would you deal with the man, by putting it that way, you slightly divert the question to their moral estimate of the person, whereas we're here trying to focus on what is his metaphysical policy. And therefore, you slightly take us off the track, but it's a minor thing. I wouldn't insist on that. Now let's look to the third paragraph. Why would a man think this way? What is the cause, the basic philosophic principle involved that made possible such a course of action and thought? Now that is your transition. That is your way of saying, getting from the example to the theory, right? And your connection is to say, well, the theory I'm going to present explains this behavior. It represents the cause that made him act this way. Now, I think there's a problem with getting to it this way, with introducing it. I mean, the first two paragraphs are okay, but when you say why, what is the cause, using that as the way to get to this principle from that example, I think leaves a problem that will lose a part of your audience, and for a very understandable reason. Why? Is it the case that the primacy of consciousness is the cause of the content of that paragraph? Well, you have to think now of the context of the reader who is reading this, and what he will be able to understand on the face of it. The primacy of consciousness, it sounds like a heavy, which it is, a heavy, big metaphysical theory about the relation of basic constituents of reality and independence and dependence. It's a very heavy abstraction. What is the event that you're trying to explain by reference to it? A tragedy came and he wished it hadn't happened. Now, most people will think, very understandably, that you do not need a whole complicated metaphysical theory to explain what would be a very natural, easy thing to understand. The man wants to be president and he thinks this is a disaster, so he wished it hadn't happened. And you see, you do not want to evoke, so to speak, an anti-philosophic response on the part of your reader. You don't want him to feel, in effect, oh, who needs philosophy to explain this? Horse sense is ample. Which it sounds like it would be. It's just common sense, and it makes the philosophy seem redundant. For that reason, I would not introduce this by saying this is the cause. And there's another aspect involved here. If you ask Senator Kennedy, do you believe in the primacy of consciousness? What would he say? He'd say, what the hell is that? So it's certainly not the cause in the sense of his explicit viewpoint. Now, if Kant did it, it would be more plausible. But in Kennedy's case, it's only by implication of things which he does believe. So it's not per se the conscious thing that's motivating him, and that makes it also somewhat dubious to talk about it being the cause. Now, you could make a case that it's the cause, indirectly, by implication, if you had a whole paper. But then you'd have to say what is really the cause in the obvious, direct sense, is all the constant attacks on reason and reality. Not necessarily the primacy of consciousness as a specific theory, but all the idea there are no facts, who can say what's true, reason is subjective, it's all a matter of opinion, we all live in our own reality. You know, there's that whole torrent of stuff, all of which, by implication, from the time you're young and so on, adds up in many people's minds to the idea, in an emergency you can make things whatever they want just by wishing it. But they don't necessarily hold this as an explicit viewpoint. That's simply the license that they're given as a result of a whole torrent of attacks on reason and reality. In that sense, you can say it's the license to the primacy of consciousness is what permits him to rationalize this behavior and state it explicitly and defend it. But you see, you need a long explanation to make that intelligible. If you just say it to a cold audience, what would explain this, and then you give them a heavy theory right away, they don't see that this kind of explanation is necessary, and consequently, you subvert your motivation. You're supposed to be intriguing them in your theory, and instead you made it seem unnecessary. So this same explanation would apply, comment of mine would apply wherever you make reference to cause. That would be, for instance, on the second last paragraph on page 9. You say this principle is the cause of our cultural disintegration. Well, there, for the same reason. I think that's too simplified a statement. You could say it's an essential part of the cause, but it would require a discussion. And you see my point, that what really is the cause is the overall attack on reason and reality, of which the primacy of consciousness is merely one aspect and one implication. And you had one further causal formulation on page 11, the second paragraph, where you say the dominance and so on produce today's culture. That is also a purely causal statement. Don't oversimplify in that way. No one philosophic idea can ruin a man or a whole society. Certainly not one as specific as this. It would have to be some much broader thing. All right. Do you have any questions or comments on that? Yes?
If he said the meaning of it is the primacy of consciousness, is that?
You would say if he said the meaning of it is the primacy of consciousness. Yes, I was going to say the better transition to get from your opening is to say this illustrates or this exemplifies, this is an example of a very widespread attitude or viewpoint, which is, you see. Now that it's an example goes without saying. This is incontestably an example, and therefore you make use of it in a way that does not raise questions that you can't deal with. All right, now let's go to your actual presentation of the essence of the theory, which is in effect from the statement in paragraph 3, a clue to the answer can be found to the end of that paragraph. Now that is really your summary of the primacy of consciousness, because the next paragraph is a quote from Miss Rand. So the essence of your theory is in this paragraph. Now, let's therefore go over this painstakingly, although I hope not painfully, but because this is your technical definitions on which the whole thing is going to rest. Now here I'm doing this because it's writing. Now if you were to say it this way in speech, I think you did excellently. But here you have a chance to think what could be misinterpreted and what should be put slightly differently, and what is essential and what can I get rid of, and so on. And therefore, you, mind you, you only had a couple of weeks, but still, you did have some time, so I want to hold you to every implication of it as an exercise, you see, in the kind of precision that is possible in writing that is not possible in speaking. Now you start, I think, excellently by saying you're going to talk about the relationship between man's mind and the external world, between consciousness and existence. Now, well, I think that particular opening is excellent. What would be wrong if you simply started with, you're going to talk about the relation between consciousness and existence? Mr. Coates.
Well, the terms would not be very clear to the average person.
Terms would be too abstract. Consciousness, that you mean by that a specific kind of faculty of man, that by existence you mean the outside physical world rather than, like, you know, the existence of rights or the existence of numbers or whichever. Those are very general terms, consciousness and existence. If you know objectivism, of course, you sling them around at the drop of a hat. But your whole thing in writing, well, ideally you don't sling them, I mean, you know. But in writing, you have to make your terms clear. And it's painful if you have to say, by consciousness I mean, by existence I mean, and therefore the much better way to do it is the way Mr. Cohen did it. Say it in a simple way first, and then right after, in what's called an apposition, your more technical statement, and therefore it's clear what you mean. And very economical, very brief. I'm going to discuss the relation between man's mind and the external world, between consciousness and existence. So we know what we're talking about. We've introduced our terms painlessly and intelligibly, and that is a very sophisticated thing to do. Now I'm going to balance that by a comment on the next sentence. Now remember, I'm allowed to read up to a semicolon and raise a question. If there was no semicolon, I couldn't stop that. But once I see a semicolon, I'm allowed to say that is to some extent it stands on its own. And here are the assumptions he lists. First is that if existence is not what one wants it to be, one can try to change it. Now, what do you say about that? Now, we're taking a pause there because there's a semicolon, which is a big thing in this kind of sentence. No, a semicolon means stop there and digest this. It can be understood on its own. First is that if existence is not what one wants it to be, one can try to change it. Now, I want you to hear that objectively, which is the whole skill that this course is supposed to be inculcating. Not from the framework of what you already know the theory, so you know what he means. You're an outsider, you don't know anything about this theory, and someone tells you, this bad idea that Senator Kennedy exemplified amounts to the idea that if existence is not what one wants it to be, you can try to change it. Now, you have a criticism of that. Freddie, yes.
Well, sling some more terms there. Makes no distinction between metaphysical and man-made.
You say he makes no distinction between the metaphysical and the man-made. You make that, that's of course is the point, but make it a little.
There are conditions of existence that you can change your job.
Very true. You could just stop right there. There are conditions of existence that you can not only try to change, but change. In fact, from a certain point of view, all of life consists of changing existence in certain ways. We don't have any food, so we plant seeds. We grow wheat. That you're changing the facts, you're changing nature, you're changing existence. You have a disease and you go to the doctor and he gives you medicine. I mean, any time you enact a cause to alter the effect, you're changing something in the world. Now, by putting it in this generalized way, you see, you make it sound as though the alternative is Kennedy or passivity. That is, either you wish existence out of existence, or you just take the kind of Hindu Stoic attitude, I'm going to change nothing. Now, obviously, you do not mean that. What do you mean? What would you have to do to correct that? Which you see is a very bad suggestion to put in someone's mind here, because they'll confuse activity with subjectivism, and therefore they'll be lost right off the bat. So how would you have to amend before the semicolon in order to cut that implication out? Yes?
I'd use a preposition there instead of a semicolon. For example, with or by.
Yes, you have to say one can try to change it by what? What's the crucial idea? We don't have to argue about the wording. Yes?
Solely with.
By solely mental means, or solely conscious actions, or solely feeling, or whatever. But you see, the essence of this is the primacy of consciousness. So it's not simply that if you don't like things, you can change them. It's that you can change things exclusively by what goes on inside your mind, without any reference to physical action. Now you see, that would be the primacy of consciousness. If you could simply say, there is no wheat, I feel like there being wheat, and say the way, God was supposed to have said, let there be light, and you could say, let there be wheat, and wheat sprouted. That's the primacy of consciousness, you see, because it's an act of consciousness producing a fact or a change in reality. By omitting that, you drop the essence of it, and you threw us off. Now, you may say, well, but in the next part, didn't I correct it by saying that the facts can be created by one's will, by hoping, by praying, i.e. by an act of consciousness? Yes. You corrected it, but it was really a shame to have needed a correction there, because when you do this kind of heavy abstract theory, you don't want, even for a minute, to leave a wrong idea and then leave the person at all confused. So the idea more or less emerges, but it's a bit mangled for that thing, because of that way of putting it. Then you say, this means that existence is dependent upon consciousness. Okay? You did give different examples: will, hope, praying. So it's pretty clear what you mean, and I think that's pretty clear. Now you say the second assumption, I'm not going to read the whole thing, you can read that right now. What do you think of that next sentence? The first assumption is that existence is dependent on consciousness. You can change it by an act of consciousness. The second is that you don't need to look outward to know it, but can look inward. Now, what do you think about that sentence at this stage? What branch of philosophy does that statement, that second one, come out of? That's epistemology, right? It pertains to you don't need to look outward in order to know existence, but you can look inward at thoughts in your own mind, and existence will follow whatever they are. So to get knowledge, you don't have to look out. Now, it's certainly true that this is connected to the primacy of consciousness. This is what would you call the epistemological correlate or corollary or implication of the primacy of consciousness. The question is only, do you need it at this point? Now remember, it's a heavy theory, right? The heavier the theory, the harder to grasp. What branch of philosophy does the primacy of consciousness come from, per se, as a theory? It's simply the relation of consciousness and existence, right? So it's essentially a metaphysical theory. Is existence independent of consciousness or dependent on consciousness? Is it out there and you have to adhere to it, or can you make it what you want? Now, that has implications for every branch of philosophy, for how you acquire knowledge, for how you define ethics, for how you define the good in politics, for how you judge works of art. It redounds throughout an entire philosophic system. But when you're giving a paper and space is at such a premium as this, the best thing is the bare minimum. On this heavy a topic, where you have so little space, why put in the epistemological implication if you can get along without it? Now, I know that you tried later to cash in on that, so you were trying, in effect, a richer presentation. You were trying to give both at the beginning, and then you would show both later, but you got fouled up somewhat, as you'll see when we get there. I'd simply say this. In certain contexts, I would certainly put both in. I believe in her article on the metaphysical and the man-made, Ms. Rand does put both in together. But then she's writing for an audience that knows something about it. She had much more space than you did, and she can elaborate at length. You've got a couple of pages, so it's really hit and run. And one of the things you have to learn is when to restrict yourself to a certain formulation and when to elaborate. And here, it's so heavy, the material, that I would say if you get that one idea in, consciousness controls existence, let it sink in for a moment. And then later, if there's time in another point in the paper, bring it in. You see what I mean? I would do that on the Crow epistemology. Too much for people to take in. Now, true, it's writing, so they can read it, and they can stop. But even so, I think it's a bit too much in this context. In other words, I'm not sure people would understand the difference between the first and the second. If they don't already know the difference between metaphysics and epistemology, I'm not sure that they would grasp what's the difference between saying consciousness creates existence and consciousness should look inward. You'd have to say, well, I'm talking about how you acquire knowledge in the second case. You need to give some kind of song and dance to distinguish the two, and you don't have space, you see. Now, I have a couple of other comments on the sheer presentation of the theory before we go on to the rest of the paper. Let's assume then that you have given clearly the idea that existence depends on human consciousness. And you've stated it, in effect, as you stated there with the few amendments that we made. Is anything else either necessary or highly advisable to include right here in order to make this idea, the abstraction, clear right at this point? Now, we have had an example, and now a definition. But I can think of a couple of things that would be very advisable in some form right here. to help take the curse off the excessive abstractness of it, to help clarify it. Yes?
Use the example to re-concretize?
You say use the example to re-concretize it. Well, you mean repeat the Kennedy example? Or?
No, but show more specifically how it concretizes.
Well, you say show more specifically how Kennedy concretizes the definition. You could repeat that, but I think that would be somewhat repetitive because he does say, he uses the actual quotes, you see, that the facts can be created by one's will, by trying to hope, by praying. He actually plays on that example in his definition, so I don't think too much more by showing that that example concretizes the definition, but you could use that example in a different way in order right there to do something else, to set off into complete relief what you are talking about. Yes? Contrast. Now, I can't emphasize to you enough the importance of contrast in presenting abstract ideas. And the more abstract, the more urgent. This is a point I believe we first made in discussing the oral presentations in Lecture 5. And it's run throughout, and I want to emphasize it again here. If you simply say, you can change reality by an act of consciousness, facts can be created by one's will, and the person doesn't know the theory, that is not per se fully clear, because the immediate question is, well, as opposed to what else? How else would you function? What could be a different? Even if it's implicit, as it pretty much is given this example, what could you say briefly right here? Suppose you didn't want to go into the whole theory of the primacy of existence, which I myself would have. I would have set it out right at the beginning. In other words, what you have on page 11 in your second last paragraph, I would put that right here to set the two in contrast. But that's optional. I wouldn't insist on that. But what you should do at minimum is say, what? Give me an idea from what I've been saying.
You mean the example?
Yes, the example. This is the primacy of consciousness. Thus, consciousness has metaphysical primacy. And right after that, what could you say? In other words, before your second last paragraph on page 9. Just in, approximately. Do you understand what I'm saying? You could take the Kennedy example and say, the opposite would be the recognition that facts are what they are, no matter who feels or thinks what. That we have to recognize them, that they're outside of our power to change by an act of will. So if you've drowned someone, you've drowned her, and no amount of wishing will alter it. You see, just that much would then let people make the connection, and you could make it briefer than that in writing, that, because I had to grope in speaking. But just that much people would say, oh, well, then the primacy of existence is the common sense idea, and the primacy of consciousness is some kind of awful aberration, you see. Whereas if you don't give the contrast, they don't know, well, even given your exact definition, that you can change things by an act of consciousness, they may conceivably take that to mean, well, thought is required to change things. So maybe you're just saying change things by an act of thought, and don't we have to think to change things, you see. To get rid of those misinterpretations right at the outset. State your contrast as eloquently and briefly as you can, either in broad theory or at least on the one example, you see. And then it really stands out. Now, as a general strategy or technique of writing, I cannot overemphasize the importance, when you introduce an abstraction, immediately to say, I mean this as against that. Do you have any questions on that point of contrast? Yes?
Well, I had a question about the word consciousness. I think that could be a little ambiguous to someone who's not familiar with this, because trying to hope for facts created by one's will and praying would be basically considered acts of not having one's mind in focus or being unconscious.
Oh, well, you're making a, so to speak, an in-objection. You're saying that by calling it consciousness, And on the one hand, and then saying, but you're changing it by hope and prayer and so on. On the other, you're saying those that an objectivist would hear those as unconsciousness and therefore be confusing. But you couldn't get around that problem. If somebody knows the objectivist terminology that well that they would think those things are unconsciousness, they already know the axiomatic use of the term consciousness, so the problem won't come up. Now, you see, we have to be very careful here. You can pick anything to pieces. Anything. Truly anything. In the Declaration of Independence, the law of identity, you name it. There's nothing that could not be misinterpreted, if you want to, or if you set your mind to it, because words are defenseless in that respect. So I'm trying to be, let us say, reasonably circumspect here and only pick on those things which I think are unequivocal. There's one other thing I think could be done with regard to clarifying it. Whether it should be done here is a different question, but I want to understand in your own mind. Mr. Cohen, when you define it as the relationship between man's mind and the external world, and then you go on between consciousness and existence, which I've already praised as an approach, where do you put God in here? In other words, do you regard the theory that God created the world, which is, God is not man's consciousness, as part of the primacy of consciousness, or what?
Yes.
You do, because that is definitely part of the theory.
It's just that I didn't want to make that distinction, because then we'll bring in the whole area of religion, and a person...
You didn't want to antagonize religious people or raise the question of religion?
I didn't want to raise the question.
Yeah. Well, it's conceivable that you didn't want to raise the question. You say you didn't want to raise the question of religion, so you restricted it to man's consciousness. That's understandable, but on the other hand, you don't really then get the full theory across in its essence, because to really understand the primacy of consciousness, religion is perhaps the best example. Religion is kind of a cosmic version of the primacy of consciousness. And if your paper is intended to explain it to people and give manifestations, it's the easiest to grasp. They can grasp human forms of the primacy of consciousness much more easily by seeing that it's the same policy ascribed to the human mind that religious people ascribe to God's mind. It immediately conveys the nature of the theory to them, and it also shows them how it's all over the place in ways that are blatant, you see. For instance, the simplest way that I have to present a class the primacy of consciousness is the question of who created the universe. The very fact that they think that question is a self-evident, important question implies existence couldn't possibly be a primary. It has to be produced by a consciousness. Now, of course, a consciousness could just always exist because you have to start somewhere, and consciousness obviously is the beginning. Now, you see, that question, who created the universe, is a classic formulation of the primacy of consciousness, or expression of it. And a very elementary class can grasp right away what the theory is, and they see the extent to which they've been influenced by it. So, in this case, I would go out of my way to include religion, partly simply pedagogically, because they'll understand the thing much better, and partly because you really would get the essence of the theory more clearly. If you didn't want to do all religion, you could put in parenthesis something like, thus consciousness, parenthesis, human or other, close parenthesis, has metaphysical primacy. And you just leave a certain suggestion. We're not saying you can worry about what it is. I myself would plunge right into it. However, did you want to say something?
Yeah, the reason I didn't discuss that particular aspect is that I wanted to restrict it to cultural areas, and not religious areas.
You want to restrict it to cultural areas, but religion has had enormous influences on human culture and has all sorts of manifestations. So
yeah, but you don't really see it, who created the universe in terms of the culture.
Well, you don't see who created the universe, but you see the churches and the synagogues and the moral codes and all the secularized versions of it also. So I'm not saying that you had to do it. I'm saying simply, in my experience, to grasp it, people will grasp it much more easily from God than they will from the antitrust, and you'll see why in a moment when we get to the antitrust. But also I wanted to be sure for your own understanding you realize that that is included.
All right. Now, just before we leave this, you recognize, of course, that when you say existence, you've already made it clear that you mean the external world, right? You mean physical reality. That's what you've talked about. Okay. I'm going to hold you to that. All right. Now, let's go on to your next division here. The antitrust laws as an example. Now, you have a couple of pages and you give essentially, go over to page 10 now, 3 paragraphs to the antitrust laws. I believe that is excessive in terms of what you have to do in the space that you've got available to you. Because from the quote from Neal, and then from Learned Hand, and then from Emanuel Seller, all make the same point, in effect, that these laws are arbitrary, non-objective, undefined, etc. Now, if you need that for your purposes, any one is sufficient. If the person needs to be convinced of that, then the example is out, because then it's more controversial than the primacy of consciousness, and you can't possibly go into it. You see, you can't have an example that raises more questions than the theory you're presenting. So either you have an audience that can grasp right off the bat, the antitrust laws are filled with non-objective formulations, or they don't. And if they don't grasp it, you can't use it. So your 3 paragraphs is much too long. 1 is the most you could use here, because you need the space desperately. And you do, because look at paragraph 3. We're on page 10 now. This is where you're finally cashing in. We've been holding now. We want to know, what has this got to do with the primacy of consciousness, the antitrust laws? Now remember, I'm reading this not simple-mindedly, but straightforwardly. In other words, I don't know the theory, and I'm trying to find out. And you say, thus the government official, this is your last sentence of paragraph 3 on page 10. Thus the government official wants law, the reality within which the businessman functions, to remain fluid, dependent on the government official's mind's formulation and interpretation. Now that is your application of, reality depending on consciousness. Now I want to ask you one question. On what theory of law could law be independent of government officials' formulation and interpretation? Law is not a fact out there in the world, intrinsic to reality apart from us. It's not like atoms or planets, etc. It's a conceptual product of an advanced civilization, fairly advanced, which already has a government, which sits down in some form of consultation, formulates rules to govern behavior, and then establishes judicial agencies to interpret what they mean and how to apply them. There's no other way to have such a thing as law. So, if you're going to say the antitrust laws illustrate the primacy of consciousness because they make law, which is the reality here, dependent on our formulation and interpretation, I'm completely stopped, you see. Then the question would be, well, then any law has to be the primacy of consciousness if this is a valid statement, and then what's the use of arguing against the theory? Then we may as well just say Senator Kennedy is right, because what he did is obviously then essential to any form of law. No law can be independent of man's mind, right? In the way external reality is. So, something is wrong here, very seriously wrong, and this is your what I meant by the essential error here. Now, what are you technically doing with the word reality? I mean that in that sentence, which is what's causing the problem. You're equivocating on reality. Reality, in the first, you meant the external world, physical existence, stuff out there, Here, you mean anything which affects human existence, in this specific case, a code of principles formulated by the government. Now, those are not interchangeable. They're related, but they're not interchangeable. You can't call one reality, and in other words, you can't say this is primacy of consciousness and save that statement by calling anything you want reality, applying the term reality to anything, you see. I have to say, if I desire a certain woman, that desire depends on my consciousness, so that's the primacy of consciousness. The reality is my desire. That's the primacy of consciousness then, but obviously that has nothing to do with the primacy of consciousness, which pertains to the relation of consciousness and physical reality. So you went off the track there completely. Now the question is, how in fact would the primacy of consciousness apply? Because it does apply here. It's true that non-objective law and so on does involve the primacy of consciousness, but by what means? What would you have to do to show that? That would be a whole production to show that, you see. That's why I myself in this space wouldn't try that example, because I wouldn't know how to do it briefly enough. But in essence, what would you have to do? If you had to explain to an audience, starting with the primacy of consciousness as he presented it on page 9, and now you want to get to how non-objective law is an example of that, what intermediate explanation would you need that would be fairly time-consuming? Yes?
How the primacy of consciousness makes the arbitrary possible.
You'd have to show how the primacy of consciousness makes the arbitrary possible. The arbitrary in what broad realm, of which law is simply one form or one example? The arbitrary in values, in ethics. That's the main connection, you see, that you omit. You'd have to say now the primacy of consciousness has implications for values, for ethics, politics, law. Some theories hold that God, if you had mentioned him, you see, creates right and wrong by a sheer declaration of his will. Others say society creates right and wrong by a sheer declaration of will. Both of those agree with the idea values are dictated by an arbitrary act of consciousness as against what? The view that value judgments have to be derived from the facts of reality objectively without reference to any whim or any arbitrary desire at all. Now, you see that this involves you in a whole application. If you, do you see what the connection is between values and physical reality? Let me put the question to you this way. If the primacy of consciousness is that consciousness controls physical reality, why does the idea that consciousness controls values imply the primacy of consciousness over physical reality? Do you get the connection?
Well, values are derived from reality.
Well, it's not just that values are derived from reality, it's that values have to be enacted in reality. You have to live on your values in reality. On any theory, you have to act in the physical world. If the rules by which you should act can be validated arbitrarily, the implication of that is reality will adjust itself accordingly. Physical reality will adapt to whatever God or society decrees. And so it's not an accident that God is the moral lawgiver and the creator of reality. Because if he weren't the creator, he couldn't be the moral lawgiver. Suppose there was reality was independent of him and he came in and said, you have to do so-and-so. And he didn't obey reality, all of his followers would be wiped out. So the only way he can, if I can use the expression, can get away with his moral laws is because he's sure that reality is going to follow him because he's in charge of it, you see. In other words, control over values by your arbitrary will is possible only on the premise of control over the physical world. And that's also why Kant, who was the real source of the idea that society creates right and wrong, although he didn't hold that, began by saying the human mind creates the physical world, you see. But you see the connection there that you'd have to spell out to make that really clear from your original definition before you say why an arbitrary declaration of law amounts to the primacy of consciousness. You'd have to make clear what's the difference between an arbitrary declaration versus deriving morals and then laws from the facts of reality. And that is a long, difficult thing to do and would give me pause. But what I want you to do is see how you're switching the point, you see. Even an objective law depends on the mind, but it's two different senses of depend. You get that? One sense is the mind has to try to discover the facts out there, including the facts to serve as the value standard. The other is the mind arbitrarily cut off from reality, decrees something, and reality snaps into line. You see that? Now, this is a very big thing that you omitted, and the result is it's just not plausible, your presentation. Now, I don't want to go on too much longer, but I can't just avoid commenting briefly on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that paragraph 5 on page 10, the very long paragraph. Because there's a number of confusions in here caused by the fact that you very much missed the point here of the application to law. You say, what possible courses of action and thought would such a businessman take? Well, one possibility would be to simply obey the law. Well, that is a very, first of all, unfortunate thing to put in here, because what does it seem to imply? That if you don't accept the primacy of consciousness, you will defy the law. Now, civil disobedience is not inherent in the primacy of existence. That's a whole separate question. When you should do it, should you do it, when should you break with society? And that's precisely what you shouldn't raise if you want your paper to be self-contained, you see. So I will certainly leave that out. But go to your second possibility. You're trying to show that the businessman enacts the primacy of consciousness given these non-objective laws, right? And you do it by saying he looks inward at his own consciousness and his desire to produce and trade goods. And you go on to imply, you see, he's on the track of the primacy of consciousness, because instead of looking outward, you say even later, he's looking inward, and then he tries to create the reality that is dependent on his consciousness, his desire to produce and trade goods. Now, what are you suggesting by that? Now, as you worded it, that suggests what? I'll ask you if you promise to give me the right answer, but I don't want to lose the class by the wrong answer. So if you definitely know, you can tell me. Yes. I scared you down. All right. No. Oh, yeah. All right. You're implying, you see, that...
Yeah, you're implying that the desire to produce... oh, you got me lost. All right, go ahead.
By saying the businessman looks inward, underscored, you are suggesting that introspection is the primacy of consciousness. That any time somebody looks inward and finds some important desire that he wants to act on, that's the primacy of consciousness. Now, that is absolutely not true. All self-knowledge requires you to look inward. All knowledge of your own motivation requires you to look inward. So you can't say, aha, he looked inward before he took this action, that's the primacy of consciousness. Absolutely not. When is it the primacy of consciousness and when isn't? When looking inward. If you look inward, remember that was as a means of acquiring knowledge. In other words, if you looked inward and you said, I have this desire to produce. I feel that this desire would best be served by keeping both hands in the air for 24 hours in the direction of Mecca. Therefore it will. Now I know that. Now then you say that's a primacy of consciousness. It's not just that he looked inward. He looked inward and he decided that what he found decreed what reality would have to do. You see, that's the primacy of consciousness, is the dependence of reality on what you find when you look inward. Now, there's nothing in what you say here about the sheer fact that he feels it is going to make reality snap into line. All you say is he's got a desire to produce and trade, which he discovered by looking inward, and he decides to do something about it. Well, if he decides to do something about it by acting in reality according to its laws, that's not the primacy of consciousness. You see how, again, you got thrown off by your idea of the primacy of consciousness. Let me put the question to you this way, to try to illustrate the problem here. If a robber holds a gun at me, and I offer him my wallet to appease him, am I guilty of the primacy of consciousness? Because I have consulted my desire. I want to live. And I've said, he holds the whip hand and sets the terms. And if I don't live up to it, I'm going to be killed. So I give him the wallet. Now, I would regard that as absolutely primacy of existence on my part. Completely rational. I introspected, and I capitulated, if you want to put it that way, to somebody else's arbitrary declaration of consciousness. But I did so with one fact that very much mitigates the circumstance here. He was holding a gun at me. See, so I was saying it's a fact of reality that I'm going to die if I don't do it, and I'm respecting facts accordingly. When would it be primacy of consciousness to pay over the money? It's all the difference in the world, and this applies also to bribes, which is your whole point. Two different attitudes can lie behind paying over a bribe. One would be just self-defense, and the other would be primacy of consciousness. And what would make the difference? Self-defense, if you simply say, this guy is a swine, he's a bastard, he's a killer, which you see is your way of saying he doesn't control reality, he is not the moral authority, he's defying reality, but he has me in my power, in his powers. That's still recognizing reality. Versus if you say, well, they all say that he's right, they must know what they're talking about, I don't know. Right is what society or the government or the robber says. That's the primacy of consciousness. Now, you can pay a bribe, as some businessmen do, on that latter method. The government must know, who am I to know, they're elected by the public, there is no right and wrong, whatever they say is valid. That's the primacy of consciousness. But the sheer act of paying is not. If you protest in your own mind. So you are, here you see, confusing the situation badly. Do you see what the confusion is? And you see the confusion is caused by the fact that you tried to short-circuit the application of the primacy of consciousness to values. You tried to go straight from control reality to the application to law, and you couldn't find the reality that was being controlled. See, because it's through values which imply physical reality. But since you didn't do that, all you could find is your desire. So you ended up in the position that it's primacy of consciousness whenever your desire has to mesh with somebody else's desire, regardless of what. And that is not true. So I would not say a lobbyist is per se a primacy of consciousness. If he's Oren Boyle, he is. Now, just those are the main points. I think the next paragraphs don't raise anything essentially different. I just want, on this point about looking inward and looking outward, you mustn't oversimplify. Is it possible for an advocate of the primacy of consciousness to look outward? I just said it's possible for an advocate of the primacy of existence to look inward. Is it possible for an advocate of the primacy of consciousness to look outward? Oh, yes. How do you think he discovers his victims? He has to look out and see all these people and all this wealth that he wants to seize and the jails he wants them to build and the torture instruments and so on. He doesn't just dream those up, so that he follows reality to some extent in order to enslave people. So you have to follow your definitions exactly. That's why I think it's dangerous to introduce looking inward and looking outward to a beginning audience in this short a space. Because, people have to think in essentials. And if they're just getting the basic idea, on top of that, where should you look to acquire knowledge? They'll simply, for short, they'll think, well, inward is bad and outward is good. And then you'll lose the essence of the point.
So, you understand my point then about, let's go over to page 11. I've really commented on all the essentials. In your last part, you go into the proper viewpoint and the errors of the primacy of consciousness. And again, those are essentially done okay. I would put the primacy of existence earlier, as I indicated. And the errors of the primacy of consciousness are okay, except one point. This is the top of page 11. One point is not too clear, that you say primacy of consciousness holds that A can be non-A. And that's true. That's the essential problem. It's a repudiation of the law of identity. And you give us the example, a dead woman can be alive if one forces oneself to believe so. That's a good example, because that's a direct A and non-A, and you've mentioned it at the opening. Your next example is not so clear, though, and you should try to give clear examples. Businessmen should look outward when producing steel, but let's not define restraint of trade, etc. There's no problem in never defining concepts. Consciousness decrees it to be so. Now that is a big mouthful, and it would not be too clear to me as a beginner, why is that A and non-A? You see, now a dead woman can be alive when she's dead. Even as a freshman, I can understand that. I mean, I can see that that's A and non-A, you see. But the next is, where does A and non-A come in? So you're better, if you want to do it briefly, state as something that the reader can get right away, rather than so complex as, well, non-objective definitions are really a violation of the law of identity, which takes so much to explain that you lost the point. Your better way to put it is, if you want another example, is your very last sentence. Businessmen can't produce under conditions which make it impossible to produce. That's a direct contradiction. To say they have to produce under conditions which make it impossible, and I decree it. You see, so I decree that the impossible is possible. That's a straight A and non-A, and it would be another good example. So if you had explained it. Other than that, though, in a brief space, you did cover that okay. So to summarize, you got the main idea correctly, but with a certain vagueness in your own understanding of it, which was brought out in your discussion of antitrust, which caused you to go off the tracks. I would have taken a different option. If my goal was cultural manifestations, I would have focused primarily on two things, or maybe three things. Psychological manifestations, such as evasion, the idea you don't have to accept reality. Religious manifestations, such as miracles and who created the universe, etc. And evaluative manifestations, the idea society or God creates ethics, the good, and so on. Because then you get the scope of its acceptance, and you can see it everywhere, you see. Then if you had time, you can go on to one specific type of law as an example. But law is so far down that it's a tricky thing to get in this space, you see. Now, Mr. Cohen, I have to give you the last word here. Do you have any last questions or comments on this? Is this clear? Okay, let us then take a break here, and we'll do the second paper after the break. All right, let us now look at the second of the two papers for tonight, On Man's Rights, by Miss Penelope Powell, who also gave me permission to use her name. Let us begin with an overall evaluation of this paper. Giving you the three basic choices, how many would say essentially positive? Fairly small number, maybe a dozen or so. How many would say mixed? Significant number, at least half.
How many would say negative? Maybe a little less than mixed. So you are spread on the lower portion of the spectrum. And I would tend to agree that there is certain problems with this, so that I would give it generally, I myself would give it a mixed estimate, but with the idea that there are certain type of problem that runs through, it would be a good paper if it wasn't for one type of problem, but it's a problem which takes a big toll. Now let's look at it first in general on the overall. What are the virtues of this paper? By a show of hands, anybody that wants to suggest. What is good about this paper? Yes?
Enthusiasm, that's...
You say enthusiasm. You mean by that what?
I mean that I think she really believes in what she's talking about, but she just hasn't put it...
Well, that's not too much of a compliment to say she believes in what she's talking about, but she just hasn't thought it through. Let's start with something a little more positive than that. Yes, at the back.
I think she starts off with an easily digestible conversation thrown together.
She starts off with an easily digestible conversational tone to get the reader into it. In other words, you're talking about her ability to attract and motivate the reader. Now, that, of course, is easier to do on this topic because you can talk to people about rights with much less motivation than about the primacy of consciousness. They've heard about rights, and they know that's a big issue, and it's politics, and it's controversial. And that's not the same thing as some heavy metaphysical abstraction. Therefore, much less motivation is needed, but her idea of a motivation, I think, is generally effective. In effect, her motivation amounts to, you talk a big game about liberty, but you don't know what it is. And I'm going to now show you. And that is a perfectly legitimate way of getting a person intrigued. And she tries to show we're all for liberty, but we don't know what to do in case of A, B, and C. And if only we knew what liberty was, which involves knowing what rights are, we would be ahead of the game. And so she tries to motivate you into the topic and in a way which I think is effective. I don't believe that long a motivation would be required, simply given the scale of space that you have, you see. You don't need that much motivation. When you say to an American, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, by the very fact of what you say in your opening paragraph, they're already interested, as opposed to when you say, I'm talking about the primacy of consciousness. But as such, you do definitely try to tie it in as your intention, leaving aside whether you carried it out fully. You try to show our foreign policy and domestic policy and the future of the country, in effect, depends on understanding these issues, which is a very proper intention. So that is good. What else about this paper? I would say again, it's clearly written. I know what is intended. It does not have rhetoric or padding in it, which is a very important thing in a philosophy paper. And I'm glad to see that you're on the premise that every sentence should say something. The writing has to be purposeful and add something, not just fill up space. And that is a virtue of this. It's smooth. What would you say about the structure, the organization of this? How it's put together? Do you know why the author discusses the topics that she does as she discusses them? I'd like to see some response from you. How many would say they know why at each point she's discussing what she's discussing? How many would say there are points where they don't, where they're lost by the structure? Would you point out one? Yes. In the green, I think. You're in green. Oh, you didn't raise your hand? Any waving motion immediately catches my eye. Is there any point that anyone would want to point out where you felt you didn't know why she was going into that? Because if there isn't, that means you know why she's doing what she's doing, so it's a clear structure. Well, since I can't, yes, at the back, yes.
I guess I didn't understand your theme, because given the title, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, I couldn't find any structure since she jumped right in with liberty and never supported liberty with the right to life from which liberty stands.
You say you didn't know her theme because she jumped right in on liberty and never supported liberty by reference to the right of life on which it depends. Well, she does say that the moral code is your own life as the primary value. She says that's partway through page 12. So somewhere she gets in life. So, but if I reformulated your point, there is something that is defective about the structure which does pertain to the theme is not clear. What is the theme of this paper as you understand it from reading it? The theme means the point she's trying to establish or the topic that she's concerned with. What is it of this paper? Is she trying to illustrate rights, correct a misconception of rights, show the moral basis of rights? What? It can't be a theme just to talk about rights in general. You have to have some specific thing you want to say about them. Now, actually, the theme that we discussed was what, Ms. Powell? To validate rights, to establish that man does have rights, to prove it, to justify the claim man has certain inalienable rights. That was the theme that was to be taken. Is it clear from this paper that that's what the theme was? Well, you might have some question because some of the validation was skimped on at the expense of more space being given to an elaboration of the idea or of some of its more remote ethical bases or some of its opposites. You distributed yourself pretty thin, you see, so that when you come to I'll show you a little later, the real essence of what is the validation of rights, it goes by like a shot out of hell. It's gone before you can turn around. And so it kind of leaves you slightly with the feeling of, well, you more or less say certain appropriate things, but you don't really settle on the issue of the validation. Yes?
Consciously made that choice because I think to an American audience, the validation doesn't have to be any more than indicated. That they are
well, you say to an American audience the validation doesn't have to be any more than indicated. That is debatable. An American audience is very sympathetic to the idea of rights, but the validation of rights is not something that was even discussed in the 18th century when the Declaration of Independence was written. They said we hold these rights truths to be self-evident, that man is endowed with certain inalienable rights. Now, self-evidence means that no validation is required. It's like A is A. You just open your eyes and you see it, which they actually did believe. The theory of the Enlightenment epistemology was that in every field of knowledge there are self-evident axioms, like A is in metaphysics. And you just look at reality and you see. And they thought rights were the axioms of politics, and that they were therefore self-evident. Now, you see, that is a big mistake. They were helpless because they were actually implicitly relying on a certain philosophy without acknowledging it, which is still true today. So you could make a case that Americans, above all, need to stress that this is not self-evident and that it needs a whole case. That would be the kind of introduction that would be good for a validation, you see. But then you'd have to really give a validation. But we'll see when we go into that. Let us perhaps go over it now and elaborate step by step. I've commented briefly on the opening paragraph, and I'm not going to try and comment on every word as we go. I think your intention was okay in this opening. On page 12, in the second paragraph, you say at the center of the idea of liberty is the idea of political rights, and here there's confusion. So you have a two-step opening. What is liberty? But liberty requires to know what rights are, and then you give us our two choices. Now tell me something, why do you do it this way? You said here there's confusion, and then you give us three choices. Should we respect the public's right to unbiased news or the publisher's right? Does the worker have the right to a job, or does the employer have the right to fire him? Are rights always more important than other considerations like providing the poor? Now, I could see two ways of making that point, and I don't see why you switched. That is, you could say the right to news versus the right to speech, the right to a job versus the right to fire him, the right to your wealth versus the right to livelihood. That would be three sets of alleged rights in conflict. And then your theme would be, what are rights really? The other way of setting up the conflict would be rights versus something else, which are more important than rights. For instance, your right to free speech versus an educated public. Your right to to fire versus employment. Your right to your wealth versus something more important, the poor. In other words, rights in each case versus something which supersedes them. Now you could do it one way or the other, but why did you switch in the middle? You see? It's slightly confusing. It would be easier if you took one tack or the other. Either you're going to say in your mind, there's two wrong views of rights. Two views of rights. And here I'm pitting them off, one against the other in three cases. Or there's rights versus non-rights, and here's the three examples, because it's just an issue of wording, because the wrong view of rights is really a negation of rights. But by confusing it the way you did here, we're just like, yes, the parallelism is lost, and it's not clear why you switched like that. All right, now we get to your paragraph 3 on page 12. We can evaluate political rights only by evaluating the underlying moral code. Now, and then the physician example, and trouble with Americans is they can't judge between two radically different ideas of rights because they have two different moralities. Now, how does that paragraph strike you right at this point? Is that convincing? That's her, in effect, passage from rights to morality. Is that a convincing transition? Now, in content, her point is correct. You can only evaluate rights by reference to morality, and it's true there are different approaches to rights and they reflect different approaches to morality. The question is, has this been made objectively clear to an audience that doesn't already know it in this paragraph? And I would say not. It's hinted, it's suggested, but the trouble is it's too fast. It goes by so fast on a key point that you wouldn't be able to take it in. Why? What kind of elaboration would be necessary for this to be clear? First of all, what is the actual tie of rights to morality? Why do rights need morality at all? You don't tell us. You say we need morality, but what about rights makes them based on morality? Why can't they be discussed without any reference to reality? What is the one thing you'd have to tell us to make it clear? Oh, she's talking about rights. Now I see why she'd have to go into morality. You just said, well, that they rest on morality. Leave aside your parallel to the physician for a minute. But why do they rest on morality? You could make it very simple, the explanation. At the very back, yes.
The definition of rights, you could begin with right as a moral principle defined.
You could say right out the bat, by rights we mean a moral sanction to a certain kind of action. Now you see, that's neutral enough so it's true in anybody's theory. A right is a moral concept. It says in a social situation, a person has the prerogative of doing thus and so, whatever it happens to be. That this is right and anybody who interferes with them is wrong. Now if you just spelled out that much, then it's comprehensible. Well, I guess your theory of morality, which is your theory of right and wrong, would obviously be relevant to your idea of rights. But if you don't spell that out, it seems, well, why do you have to go into morality? Now, you see, it wouldn't have taken much, but one more statement, one more connection so we see why we have to go back to morality. Now, you say here, the parallel to the physician. He has to have some standard to judge the drug. And you say his code of ethics, to heal the sick. Now, to heal the sick is not a code. What does a code mean? A code is a whole constellation of values, organized systematically by certain principles, which tell you what to do in a whole bunch of situations. To heal the sick is not a code, it is a purpose, an ultimate goal, you see. And so if you want to show them you need a whole code of morality, this is not too clear an example. All it shows is that we have to have some purpose if we're going to judge our actions. And a person could say, well, sure, we have to have some purpose. We want individuality, or we want freedom, or we want Americanism or something, so therefore we should have rights. Why do we need a whole code, you see? Why a whole production? Now remember, it's not enough to motivate people to start your discussion. You have to motivate them at each step, and you're going to go plunge us into morality, but we're not prepared yet to see why it's really necessary. So you have to say something about, since these are moral concepts and they pertain to how human beings should relate to each other in all kinds of different circumstances, they obviously depend on a whole way of life. And we have to see what this could consist of, you see. But the analogy to the doctor isn't too convincing here. Nor is your reference to two radically different evaluations of rights based on two mutually exclusive codes. Why not? You gave us just the faintest example of some differences. You didn't summarize. You didn't say in that preceding paragraph. There are two basically different theories of rights. The first half of my sentences represent one and the other. You just said questions that an ordinary person would hear. Well, yeah, those are questions. How many different theories there are, he may not be clear, particularly since you didn't keep your parallelism, you see, in your wording in that paragraph. So he's just got the intimation here. Well, I guess there's different approaches to what rights are, but whether there's two radical different or four, he doesn't know yet. And right at that point, without further elaboration, you plunge into, there's two mutually exclusive moral codes, and it's simply too much to be convincing. He's kind of half-grasped, he's kind of half-grasped that there's a variety of views on rights, and half-got that has something to do with morality, and suddenly there's two mutually exclusive resting on two mutually opposite, and it's too big a structure. If I judge by my own internal state, I would feel the thing collapses. It's too much, too vague, and you would be better, therefore, organizationally, I think, to do it like this. Either say, there are two different theories of rights, and elaborate it right there. Theory one says so-and-so, theory two says so-and-so. Now, how could we explain these? And then go into, they rest on two opposite moralities. That's one way. Or say, if you could find a way to do it, let's forget about rights. Rights, after all, are a moral concept, so we have to go into morality. There's two different theories of morality. Let's look at those first, and then I'll show you they lead to two different theories of rights. That's another way. But you tried to combine it all together in one paragraph, and you didn't quite do either. So all we end up with is the net feeling, well, there's a lot of theories of rights, and they're somehow connected to morality, and I'm not going to go to morality, but it's so fast, none of it is established. I think that by the crow, you would be defeated. You wanted to say something on that.
I just wanted to say that I didn't mean that sentence to refer back to the earlier examples, but to introduce paragraphs.
Oh, well, you said you didn't mean that sentence about the two radically different values to refer back, but it's sort of hard not to read it back because you've just given us the examples. So I would have assumed that. Otherwise, you'd have to tell us as a simple fact, there are two different evaluations, and they rest on two different theories. See, you have to take less for granted, do it a little more slowly. Okay, now let's look at the first moral theory as you presented. This is paragraph 4. The man who upholds the first of these two moral codes. Now that paragraph is in effect your overall validation of the proper theory of rights, correct? It's not? It comes a little later. There's more of it, yes, but this is one key point, one key part of it. So let's look at this. Well, how do you estimate this? Now let me ask you. You're looking at this paragraph 4 on page 12. Someone who does not know this material and is hearing this as a moral code which leads to one theory of rights, as opposed to the other which comes in the next paragraph. The first moral code you hold as your supreme value, as the primary value against which all else is measured as good or evil, his own life, its furtherance and fulfillment. Now how does that strike you?
Is that clear? Is that questionable? Does that raise problems? What? Now, this is similar to a certain wording in one of the papers on the draft, I think, that I did, and it has the same type of problem, which is what? Yes? Well, you say instead of saying his own life, it should have been man's life, but she wants to get in selfishness. Because without selfishness, rights won't stand, as opposed to what comes the public good later. So, yes?
That first sentence could be interpreted as hedonistic.
The first sentence could be interpreted, you say, as hedonistic. It could be interpreted as, in effect, anything goes. Just that first sentence. The primary value against which all else is the furtherance and fulfillment of your own life. Now, that raises the question, your life at any price, your life by any means, can you do anything you want to others? Is fulfillment whatever you feel it is? Now, when you go into anything pertaining to selfishness, you have to bear in mind the way that is understood today, that term. The context is enormously hostile to it and is fraught with implications such as selfishness means whim worship and selfishness means cutting other people's throat and all that kind of stuff. Now, you can't go into a song and dance every time, but you have to say something. You have to say to some extent, if you're going to go into it this abstractly. You see, I would try to avoid it. In a paper on the validation of rights, I would try to get away from life as the standard and selfishness as the means, because there's no time to explain all those things. But if you were going to, if there was no other way, put in parenthesis, by selfishness I do not mean, cutting other people's throats, etc. I mean acting according to reason, survival by your own mind, etc. Something with each man as an end in himself, not sacrificing others. Something simply to make it clear. That is absolutely indispensable for clarification. Now you may say, but in the next sentence, you said rational selfishness. So doesn't that really answer it? And what's the answer to that? Yes?
Well, somebody could, if they were one could misunderstand this by saying it's rational to be Nietzschean.
You could say it's rational to be anything without a definition. It's very common to say bank robbers are rational because they have to think to figure out how to crack the vault. So they have to know science and they study safe cracking. And so, now, obviously, that's not rational as you mean it, but these things are not obvious. So up to this point, by saying everything, all else is measured by your own life, it does convey, without further definition, it's deuce as well as anything goes. Now you say, on that base, you must evaluate political rights as a necessity, because without them, you don't have the right to take the actions necessary to support and further your life. But now, which actions are necessary to support and further your life? Which of the two theories of rights does this validate? You said there's two radically different evaluations. Now, I could read this. Rational selfishness, or whatever that means, is I've got to be selfish and get whatever I can to survive, and therefore I need rights. Well, that means, I'll just show you how it could be read. Well, that means I got to have information. I don't know how to act. Therefore, we have to have a law that there should be unbiased news. And it means I got to have a job or I can't support myself, and my own life is the standard to which all else is determined. And if I don't get a job, I don't live. I'm going to use my mind on my job, so I'm going to be rational. So therefore, the government has to legislate jobs. And if I'm too poor, if I can't eat, what's the use of talking about my life? So therefore, okay, I can see, I agree with this, and therefore she means to say that the rights is the public's right to news, the worker's right to a job, and providing for the poor. Now you see, it can be read that way. That is not a distortion. And it's not that you wrote poorly.
You did it as clearly as you could do within what you tried to do, but you tried to do the impossible. You're trying to condense a whole code of ethics into a paragraph, and it can't be done. It simply can't be done. And therefore, you have to decide to yourself, instead of trying to say, I'm going to say life is the standard, your own life, by the means of reason, etc., give a little précis of a whole code of ethics. What one point could I bring out that would be understandable, even if not the whole thing on its own terms, that I could then hang rights on, you see, if I want to show its moral base? You couldn't do it this way. You see, you're trying to do too much. And it's motivated by conscientiousness, but I deliberately show you how it can be misread. Now, what would be an example? I'm not asking you to rewrite the paper, but what might you hang the thing on? One simple thing. Yes?
Well, that in order to live and support yourself independently, you've got to be free to follow your own reason and your actions.
Well, you say in order to live and function independently, you have to be free to follow your reason and your actions. That, of course, is true, but then you're making independence the primary. I can think of an easier way to do it. Yes? You say hanging on property rights, but I mean, what is the moral peg on which you're going to base rights? She wants to show that rights depend on a certain moral theory, and she hasn't got the space to give the whole moral theory. So she wants to say something that'll suggest a moral code, which will contrast to the later moral code, which she's going to make the contrast to, but without committing herself to a little full-scale presentation which she hasn't got the space for. That's the problem, you see. Yes?
Could you just exclude the initiation of force?
Well, then you're kind of right. If you say just exclude the initiation of force, you're not going to base it on anything. That, in this context, is the form of respecting rights. And therefore, if you do that, you're keeping it only on a political basis, so you're giving up the moral basis. No, she wants to contrast it later with the service to the public good, so the obvious thing is what? To put in here. Yes?
Egoism.
But egoism, yes, but in what way? If you say rational selfishness, you already open the can of worms, at least to that extent that you have to give a paragraph what you mean and what you don't mean. But there's an easier way of saying the same idea. Yes? Something on that order. One code holds that each man is an end in himself, that he may properly pursue his own happiness, neither sacrificing himself to others, etc. You know that. Utter that in a sentence or so. If that's so, he can't be sacrificed to others. He has a right to his own actions and their results. You see, now that is not a complete case, because why is man an end in himself? You're not trying to answer that. But what it does do is put it in a formulation which doesn't raise all the negative connotations without a chance of you answering it in a way which is plausible and understandable, and still it's not the whole case. And it contrasts easily. Now go to your next paragraph. Now this is the second last paragraph on page 12. The only other alternative you say is that you don't hold your own life as the highest value. You hold the public good, and everything therefore has to be judged by how well it serves the public good. And then you say, regardless of whether it's God or whichever, if it's something other than man's life, then his life is potentially expendable. Now, you threw in man's life here. And in the preceding paragraph, you said what? His own life. Now, just as a point of clarification, you know the distinction Ms. Rand makes between those two points, between man's life and his own life, because she has a very exact formulation of that in Galt's speech to cover the distinction there. Who is familiar with that? Now, this is a technical point, but since you make reference to it, I'd just like to call it to your attention. What is that distinction? Yes?
Man's life would be the standard, his own life.
Man's life she calls the standard of ethics, his own life the purpose. This is not the same thing. The standard is the broad abstraction that is the same for everyone. And that by saying man's life is the standard, You indicate, therefore, there are certain objective principles which apply to everybody. It doesn't depend on whether you want it or you don't want it, you like it or you don't like it, it's nothing. It's simply inherent in man's nature and the requirements of his life. Now, to achieve that, you then have to aim at your life by following the rules of what's required for man's life. So you get your own life as the purpose. You see, but those are not the same thing. And in the course of validating an ethics, you first validate the standard. You say that man's life is the standard, and then you show that that in itself necessitates egoism as the form of implementing it. But those are not the same, and you have a tendency here to equate the two. Yes?
Is that why in the preceding paragraph you would have preferred man as an end in himself?
Yes, that's the main reason why, because I wouldn't want to raise the issue of what's the standard, because it's simply too abstract to discuss in this context. Now, I want to get, above all, to this analogy between the physician and the altruist. That is your point that if the physician who holds the advancement of medical knowledge as his primary has to sacrifice his patients if it advances medical knowledge. And then you go on to a long paragraph there on 12 and the top of 13, essentially trying to show that if you have two different goals, they're going to have to conflict, and one is going to have to be sacrificed to the other. Now, that strikes me as a inappropriate procedure here. Why did you think it's necessary to go at such length into this analogy and the elaboration of why altruism and egoism are incompatible with each other?
I think it's the primary political error that Americans make.
Which is the primary error?
They try to, at the same time, support selfishness, man's rights, and also support...
Yes, well, you're right that the primary error is they try to support man's rights and altruism. But is the cause of that error that they don't see that altruism and egoism are incompatible with each other? No. Not if the terms are defined. All it is that they don't connect morality and politics. And they think you should live to serve others, that's a moral issue. And then when politics come, they think each person should be free. They don't give full meaning to altruism. There is no problem, per se, in showing that altruism and egoism are incompatible. Altruism and egoism. It's obvious from the definition, if you have the definitions down in terms of essentials. Egoism says man is an end in himself. He should live for his own sake. The antithesis of altruism, and remember your paragraph starts, the only other possible alternative, is the antithesis of egoism in the strict sense is not altruism. If you want to be very exact, the antithesis of man is an end in himself is what? One main idea, and it's not that he should serve others. That's only one form of the opposite. What is the essential opposite of the idea that man should live for his own sake, that he should be selfish or that he's an end in himself? It's not that he should serve others. That is not the opposite. I heard it over here somewhere. Who said that? Yes. That man should sacrifice himself is the opposite. No, that is not altruism. Now just let me elaborate that for a moment. The essential opposite is man is a sacrificial being. He is a being who should put something above himself and surrender himself or abnegate himself to that thing. But now what that thing is wide open, and I'll give you three possibilities. One is God, which used to be, for a long time before other people got into the act, the main idea was all of mankind should sacrifice themselves to God. And the contrast was selfishness versus service to God. And if you tried in the medieval period to say, I'm going to give my service to my fellow men, I'll just forget God and serve my fellow men, that would have been blasphemous, and that's a crime. Now, true, there was a certain element of altruism because you're supposed to love your neighbor as one means of serving God. But it's still true that the primary antithesis was place God above yourself. Now, God, in effect, fell out of favor after the Renaissance. And little by little, your neighbor took over. So it was only really the 19th century that this was fully accomplished. And that was the century in which the term altruism was invented by Auguste Comte. And then it was the idea, he explicitly said, we need something like God to which man will sacrifice himself, but people don't believe in God anymore. So what will we do? And he said, let's call it le grand être, the great being society, humanity. And he is really the one who formalized the conversion from God to altruism in the sense of society as the primary. But there's many other possibilities. There are Orientals who say everyone should be sacrificed to nothing. Neither God nor society. We should embrace nirvana as an end in itself. Now, when they go out and writhe in the desert, you know, and so on, it's not because they think they're going to make their neighbor happy. They don't believe in a Judeo-Christian God. It's, for them, it's part of an out-and-out assault on existence as such, and they worship nirvana, non-existence as such. You know, if you take that type indicated by Schopenhauer. Or you take Kant, for instance. Now, he has it set up so that the more miserable you make everybody, the better, including yourself. He is certainly not an altruist. His ethics is organized so that everyone should sacrifice themselves to the categorical imperative for just its sacrifice for its own sake. Now, these are all, in effect, variations within one essential. And therefore, it's true that the commonest version on the street in the West is a secularized religious version, which is altruism. You know, that you should live for others and the public and so on. But if you're presenting a theoretical basis and introducing it as the only other possible alternative, the alternative is man as an end in himself, or he is a sacrificial being, which should sacrifice himself to something, you see. And then in the context of politics, either he sacrifices himself to the government, or the government is the representative of that something. You see, so, and it comes down to, he has no autonomy. Now, if you present it that way, you do not have to write any analogies as to why these two are inherently opposed, because it's obvious. There's no possible way of combining them. They're opposed root and branch from the beginning on out, you see. But by not going to the essence of the contrast, you put yourself into the position as though, well, there's something tenuous about this contrast here, and I have to argue it. Now look at the problem with your analogy, which you go to some substantial length. How often is it that there's an inherent clash between advancement of medical knowledge and advancement of your patient's health? That is a rare thing. That would be a freak case where there would be that kind of clash, because in the great majority of cases, you learn as you're treating the patient, and the patient benefits from your knowledge. Those two are by no means fundamental opposites. You can construct a situation where a mad doctor would sacrifice a certain patient in the name of experimental knowledge, but then he's dropping the whole context and he's perverse and so on. You can construct it, you did. But it is not a good analogy if the concern is to illustrate sacrifice versus egoism, because sacrifice and egoism are against each other from the word go. They're complete opposites at root in every respect across the board. There's no even beginning of compatibility. So your problem with this is, first, the analogy is not very convincing because it's not a close analogy at all. It's two things that most of the time go along okay. And if you get that idea in your reader's mind, and he thinks, well, egoism and altruism is like the doctor, which means in a few cases we have to be careful. So let's put it like this, and let's have egoism and altruism just the way you would have advance your knowledge and your patient's care, only we'll have a principle in our Constitution that wherever it interferes with the welfare of the person, of the individual, we'll have to have a vote before we do it. It's a rare thing anyway, so what's the difference? Now, you can't leave the possible implication that something that profound is a kind of a far-out conflict that wouldn't come up that much or that's esoteric. The very fact of introducing an analogy already undercuts your case, because if it was properly presented, it should be so naked, the clash of the two, that it doesn't have to be argued for. Now, this is generally an important point in strategy, when to argue and when not. You know, there is such a thing as gilding the lily. In other words, the thing is already so terrific, and you add in something more, you defeat what you started with. If your point, if you had presented it correctly, it would be nakedly pit two opposed ethics. If you then go on and say, now I'm going to give you an argument why these two are opposed, the reader stops altogether, because he said, well, I must have misunderstood since it seemed so obvious from before. And then you hear an argument that's not too good, and you say, I don't see it now. And she told me I didn't get it before, so I don't get it, period, and I don't agree with it. The whole thing is out, you see. So you have to be careful when you argue this type of point. And here I think it's very ill-advised to argue, certainly by means of this analogy. Now, if you felt in your mind, well, the trouble is Americans don't see something here, define exactly what they don't see. It's not that they don't see that two fundamentally opposed ethics can't be combined. It's that maybe they don't see that altruism is the exact opposite. If they don't see, then make that point. Then stress. The essence of this idea of serving the public good is that you are a sacrificial being. You don't exist for your own sake. And therefore, the state can do with you whatever it wants, as opposed to you having autonomy, you see. Then you can say, right on the face of it, you can't combine the two, and it's obvious. Yes?
I was thinking in my mind that I agree with her. How would you approach it if you think that the general American thinks that philosophically they can have a mixed bag the same as they do economically? How do you approach it?
How would you approach it if you say the general person reading it thinks that they can have philosophically a mixture the same as they can have economically a mixture? Well, I would approach it by saying since they can't have it economically, they can't have it ethically either. But there's a question of what is your theme. Now you have to keep in mind your space. You're trying to give the validation of rights in this paper. So you have to treat the issue that you can't combine inconsistent theories as a side issue. If you are going to make a big issue of that, then your theme is the need of moral consistency. Why you can't live a contradiction. Why contradictory theories will erupt in practice. That's not your point here. Your point is here. Rights rest on a certain code of ethics, and that's their validation. And then you say at the end, you don't accept that code, you don't have rights. You only accept it partly, you're going to wreck rights, but that's another subject. The main focus has to be, here's the theory, and here's what it rests on, you see. And then you bring in altruism or sacrifice simply as the clarifying contrast. You see, you can't cover everything. So if you think the person is really going to, in effect, dishonestly try to combine things, and he's a real mixed economy type, it's a different paper. Here you're trying to present the essential theory, you see. So you can't, on that level, argue with someone who wants to have his rights and eat them too. First, you have to show him what his rights depends on them. The next paper is why he can't have them both ways. All right, now, we are over on to page, 13 now. So I indicated why I don't believe that the top paragraph is essentially necessary if it had been presented correctly. The end of it is correct of that paragraph. Sometimes we recognize rights and sometimes sacrifice them to the so-called higher value. That is correct, but I don't think it's clearly explained because so far the basic moral issues have not been made clear of what is a sacrifice and what isn't, what kind of rights follow from what kind of code, you see, which we haven't yet seen. But now we get to your paragraph on page 13. Now, the results of this is the second paragraph on page 13. the results of the moral code of altruism, regardless of what value standard is chosen as higher than man's life, etc., and the rights that make his proper survival possible have been demonstrated in China and Russia. Now just take that sentence first. What is the problems with that wording? What questions would that raise already in people's minds? What does the term altruism convey to most people as a term? At the back, yes. I thought I saw a hand there. What does the term altruism convey to most people? Being nice to people, being kind, and so on. You have not given it any definition. You can't, it's the same as selfishness. That's the kind of term that has to be explained. You have to say, by altruism, I don't mean just being kind and so on. I mean the theory of self-sacrifice for the sake of others. I would avoid it. I would say man is a sacrificial being. Now you say, the rights that make man's proper survival possible. Well, if you had explained that, the validation is over. Because this is exactly the validation. The validation is to show that certain rights are necessary to make man's proper survival possible. But that's what you haven't yet shown us, you see. Which rights and why and what is man's proper survival? So here, it's like begging the question. You're passing over as though you've covered what is the essential point. And you say it's been demonstrated in China and Russia. Well, now what do most liberals say about China and Russia if you tell them they exemplify altruism? They have a very standard comeback, which you have to know exists so you can either answer it or avoid it. What is the standard comeback if you tell a liberal China and Russia and communism represents the extreme of the altruism and sacrifice? And what is their standard answer? Yes?
The theory is correct, but it's not practiced properly.
No, they have a better answer than that. They say the theory is correct, but it's not answered correctly. It's not applied properly. No, they have a more germane objection. It's not valid, but they have a comeback. They'll tell you, I had professors who used to tell me this, and they actually believed it. They'd say China and Russia are the most selfish countries in history because they're ruled by an oligarchy, a small group who have higher living standards than all the rest, who are motivated only by material wealth and power lust and their own glorification, and therefore it's the incarnation of selfishness. These selfish monsters are ruling. They just pretend that this is a country of self-sacrifice, but really it's ruled by selfishness. Whereas America is a democratic country and everybody sacrifices himself for the majority, and so this is really the country of self-sacrifice. Now that's all wrong, but that's very widespread line among liberals. Therefore, you have to say something to cut that out. Now, of course, the motive of the rulers is a fallacy because that's not what determines the essence of the country. They still can get whatever they're after. Not that they really are selfish by an objective test, but even counting that, they can only get what they're after by counting on people's willingness to sacrifice themselves. They don't dare preach selfishness, and so you can refute this. That's not the point here. The point is here you can't just throw it away. That's the issue of your thing is not self-contagious. You're not familiar with yet what people would say, and this is one case. Now, while we're on the question of the validation, you go in that paragraph on page 13, all the results of trying to mix two different codes. And it's hard to follow how clear it is because neither code has really been presented, you see, so it's hard to tell. You haven't really told us what altruism is, nor what rational selfishness is. So it's hard for me to judge how much of this would be clear to a person. Why would a mixed economy result from a mixture of moral codes? And why is that unstable? And why do we have a mixed concept of rights? We don't yet know what rights really are. So why do we have a mixed concept? And what does it mean to hold man's life as the consistent value standard? Because you left open, how do you live by it? And above all, how was our foreign policy the result of the attempt to consistently defend liberty without first defining what it is? Now, I don't think our foreign policy, I'm not here being sarcastic, is the result of any purpose at all or viewpoint. It's very debatable whether we have a foreign policy in any sense of the term. I mean, I think it's just like a man walking down the street who's drunk does not have any particular motivating premises. He just simply reels from obstacle to obstacle. Now, I don't think it's that Carter or anybody wants to defend liberty but hasn't defended it. He just simply wants, you know, to get through the disaster of the moment and then pray till the next one. So it's almost giving him credit to say he's ideologically confused. He hasn't reached that stage yet. But in any event, I don't think these consequences, you see, have been prepared or are clear. Now, you go back then in your second last paragraph on page 13 to more elaboration on the moral code at the base of rights. And this is a little better because you give some content to what you mean by the mind and the proper method of survival and freedom. It's very brief, but what baffles me is why didn't you combine this with the other?
I didn't think the reader would be able to hold in his head everything.
You didn't think he could hold it in his head, but this all at one time, except this is an essential elaboration of the proceeding to make the proceeding even graspable. Without this, or something on this order, the first is so vague it could be taken as anyway. Even here, it's very brief because you say the moral code acknowledges that he has to use his mind and so on, and that his survival requires his freedom to act on the judgment of his mind. Why? Why does it? That's the essence of the validation of rights. Now, wait a minute. The essence of the validation of rights is that man's survival requires the freedom to act on the judgment of his mind, right? That's the whole thing. If man was not a being who survived by his mind, he wouldn't have rights, nor need rights, nor any such conditions of existence. Rights are conditions required by a rational being, right? So and this is the paper on the validation. That sentence should be the theme of the paper. That should be the explanation of that point, should be the essence. Why a rational being has to have freedom to survive. Would be the whole argument. See, and then I would go into why. It's, you know, mind versus force. You know, why it's a destruction. Force is the destruction of his means of survival. And therefore, he has to have his mind preserved. And that means liberty and the products and rights and the pursuit of happiness, etc. But if you don't elaborate that, the whole validation is simply an arbitrary declaration, in effect. Actually, if I was to give a full validation, I would say rights depend on 4 principles of ethics. 4 different pillars of ethics, every one an essential of the objectivist ethics. Rights depend, first of all, on life as the supreme value. Because if that wasn't so, you couldn't even begin with a right to life. They depend, secondly, that man survives by reason. And reason can only function if left free. That's the right to liberty. They depend, thirdly, on man has a right to pursue his own life. In other words, selfishness, ethical selfishness. And that is, in ethics, in politics, the right to the pursuit of happiness. You see. And fourthly, they depend on the fact of mind and body being a union. And therefore, man can't survive simply by thought, but by the union of thought and action, and including physical products, which means the right to property. So if you were going to validate rights, it would have to be an ethics which holds life as the standard of value, thought as the means of achieving it, selfishness as the ultimate purpose, and physical action and achievement as the form which thought has to be expressed in. Now that is, in other words, productiveness. That is the whole objectivist ethics. Oh, and that's what then leads, you can just read it off, to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. you see. So you need a whole code of ethics if you're giving a whole detailed one. But you could get away with just reason because you can leave life to implication in this kind of paper. But I just mentioned that so you'd see the full picture. Just a few last comments, not to go on too long. On the bottom of page 13, I would want very much the insertion of one word in the first line of that last paragraph on page 13. A consistent definition of political rights as freedom from force by any man or group. What one word should be is very important to insert if you're discussing these topics. Very important, yes. Well, initiation of is two, but then add in a third one. The third is the one with a P, is the most important here, with a PH. Physical force, because force is one of those terms also that's used, you know, I'm forced to take this job because the employer won't give me any more money. And force and compulsion is used all over the place. It has to be very clear if you're talking about rights, you're only allowing physical force. You don't even have to bother with fraud in a brief paper. But if you don't put that in, it's wide open. Anybody can say, oh, well, that's a utopian theory. Everybody is forced to do things he doesn't like. You are forced to sit there and listen to me go on and on when you're already bored out of your mind. So what's, you know. And in a certain usage you're forced by politeness because you're bored but you can't go home. Only that is not what you're talking about, you see. So that is a very crucial thing. Now there are many other things here of a lesser nature that I might comment on, but on the whole I think the top paragraph on page 14 is clear and accurate. It would have been a little better if you'd shown how the altruist or self-sacrifice approach led to the opposite interpretation, because it would have made clear why ethics is so essential to this topic. But even so, you essentially did it. I just question that sentence on the right to own property. Near the bottom of that paragraph, the right to own property guarantees the continued possession and right of disposal of whatever a man possesses by purchase, gift, or inheritance. Now you left out one very big thing there. What about production? What about actually achieving it? What about creating it instead of just getting it from somebody else? So that's actually the root. So you have to be careful on those formulations, but I won't worry about those right here. And then your end would be a decent summary if you had, you know, come through with it on the way. So what I would say in sum is that your intention was certainly good, and you did try to get the moral basis in, but I think what threw you off is not knowing what level to pitch the approach to morality. And you did too much and too little at the same time from two different aspects, you see, and the result is it was a kind of hit-and-run presentation of the morality involved, and therefore the thing I don't think came across very convincingly. I don't know if you agree with that, but that is the best assessment that I can make. Do you want to make a final comment?
No, I think I'll have questions later on that.
Okay, well think about it, and you can always ask a question next week on that. It's getting late, so we're going to stop on this paper for tonight. I'm going to ask you to read the next two papers for next time. Thank you very much. Now I have a number of written questions. What is the distinction between ontology and metaphysics? Why is primacy of consciousness a metaphysical issue and not an ontological one? Ontology, for all practical purposes, is a synonym of metaphysics. It's a synonym used by professional philosophers. There's no good reason for that, and objectivism doesn't make any significant distinction between the two terms. but we speak of metaphysics, but you could call it ontological if you want. Is the designation primacy of consciousness originated by Miss Wren? Yes, to my knowledge. I never heard of that by anybody else. Are the laws of contradiction and identity implicit in direct perception, or are they deduced a posteriori? By a posteriori, I assume you mean from experience? In any event, the laws of logic cannot possibly be deduced, neither a posteriori nor any other way. What would you be relying on to do the deduction? The laws of logic are the laws which govern all reasoning and certainly all deduction, and therefore to reach them by deduction would be necessarily circular. So the laws of logic, as Aristotle, the father of logic, first pointed out, have to be available in direct perception. Now, in what exact form, in what way they're known, in what way they're implicit, and so on, is a complex epistemological question. Obviously, it is not the case that as the young baby is spanked, he opens his eyes and says nothing can be A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. So that's a more technical question to elaborate, but I won't go into that here. But yes, they have to be implicit in the first perception. How do you establish the standard of normalcy? For example, how do you know that a colorblind person is not normal? Well, there's many different contexts for normalcy, psychological normalcy, physiological, etc. But here, it would not be simply the majority rule. If you took the majority of people and gouged out their eyes, that would not make having two eyes abnormal. It would make it rare, unusual, but not abnormal. Normal really means that which pertains to the norm, that which is inherent in the species, if not damaged or harmed in some way. Colorblind person, for instance, would not be normal because he lacks a certain capacity to discriminate, which is inherent in a human being. And his organs had to be malformed or not develop in that way in order to reach that stage. And we know it's a lack because he lacks something that human beings have, a certain capacity to discriminate. So it's a damaged version of a human being to that extent. That does not mean, in order to be consistent with what we said when we were discussing that, that does not mean his perception is invalid. It does mean his organ is not normal. So he perceives it in a form which in that respect is different from a normal human being. And he has to learn by reasoning certain things that a normal human being gets by direct perception. Are characteristics of language, such as spelling, pronunciation, grammar, word meaning, etc., arbitrary? If not, by what standards can we properly call someone more or less educated, literate, refined, proper, etc., with respect to language? Well, I'm not going to go into refined and so on, but I'll take the first question. Word meaning is certainly not arbitrary. Word meaning is the essence of concepts. A word is simply the symbol of a concept. The only arbitrary element is what particular sound you use to stand for a certain concept. But the essence of meaning is the relation between the word and the thing. What entities you separate in reality from which others, what essential you see uniting them, how you therefore organize the perceptual data. That's the essence of what words denote. And that is in no way arbitrary if you know the objectivist theory of concepts. Grammar. No, grammar is certainly not arbitrary. Grammar is basically the science of how concepts can be and ought to be combined in order to be able to make intelligible conjunctions of concepts. If I say the cat is on the mat, I'm taking cat, is, mat, and so on, which are all separate concepts, and putting them together in such a way as to make an utterance about a state of affairs in reality. And there are certain rules inherent in the nature of concepts and of the facts of reality as to how you can combine words. It is not an arbitrary social declaration. If people were to say, oh, you can combine them in any way, it's still not true that you can actually talk about reality by so doing. If I say the cat and up, I've combined concepts ungrammatically and unintelligibly at the same time, nor is any social decree alter that. So grammar is not arbitrary. Now, when you say spelling and pronunciation, philosophy has nothing to say on those 2 points. This does not mean that you are therefore justified in spelling anything any way you want on the grounds of it's not philosophical, so anything goes. Or in pronouncing anything, because after all, you want to communicate, and so you want to be consistent in your usage for your own sake and for the sake of communication. And since you did not invent the language and spend an awful lot of time learning it, which you had to before you could get to the stage of asking these questions, the sensible thing is to spell and pronounce the way the people who speak that language do. It would be uselessly eccentric to decide I'm going to be an individualist and spell plum P-L-O-O-Q, because after all, spelling is arbitrary. Not only no one else would know what you're spelling or pronouncing, but even you wouldn't retain it, because you have to automatize these things from the time you're young when you first learn them. So they're arbitrary in the sense if you couldn't list a rule in favor of certain spelling rather than others offhand, except consistency and simplicity. Why have it complicated? And it is true that English has a very unfortunate spelling because so many different languages and periods went into it. The spelling in English is much more complex, but then there are advantages that you get from that too, and I think it's uselessly utopian to talk about reforming English spelling. So I'm perfectly content to be a complete conformist. In fact, I pride myself in my spelling. Now, I have a number of questions on epistemology. Well, first, let's see, do I have any from the floor? Okay. Since epistemology is concerned with the specific details of an aspect of human consciousness, why is it not a branch of science, as, for example, psychology is? Well, that's a good question, and the answer is twofold. Partly because it is universal in its scope. Epistemology, and that's a mark of philosophy. It's not universal in that it studies everything, but that it studies all knowledge. It lays down the rules for knowledge in every field, not just in psychology, but in astronomy, in physics, in mathematics, in economics, etc. As such, it is not restricted to any area, but covers the entire universe. It studies man, but it studies how he knows everything. And from that aspect, it's unrestricted. The other main thing about it is that it is a normative science, whereas psychology is descriptive. Psychology doesn't say what you should do, but what you are. Epistemology's primary concern is how you should think if you are to achieve knowledge. It lays down normative standards. What is truth and how should you conduct your mind in order to achieve truth? And from that aspect, as a normative subject, it obviously is essentially different from any descriptive subject. Now, of course, it has descriptive elements in it, just as ethics does. It's based on facts, but its concern is to lay down standards. But that's a very interesting question. Is it possible that any as yet unknown facts about how the mind or brain work would necessitate a change in the theory of epistemology? Well, I could only say this. How would you learn those facts? By what method of knowledge? Are you going to be using sensory observation or conceptualization or logic as we now understand those things? If so, you can't use them to destroy themselves. Or what? In other words, I do not believe that any specialized data about the mind or brain could possibly necessitate a change in epistemology, because epistemology lays down the basic principles of acquiring knowledge as such at any stage of knowledge. And from that aspect does not depend on specialized knowledge, and you have to have an epistemology to acquire that specialized knowledge. Now, the only thing, therefore, I could say is as pure hypothetical speculation, in order not to make philosophy sound like it floats free of all facts. If somebody discovered some button in the brain or whichever, that could be shown to affect the essence of how man acquires knowledge. I can't imagine what it would be. Then, obviously, it would affect epistemology. And suppose, for instance, we discovered this knob inside the brain. And I don't know, I'm just making this up as you go. If you don't drink grape juice in the morning, the knob swells, and I don't know, you lose all your concepts or something. Then it would be a basic rule of cognition to drink grape juice every morning. You'd have to add that in. But it sounds implausible. If you ask me, is it possible? I'd say, I have no evidence that it is. And the onus of proof is on he who asserts the positive, including the possibility. In developing her theory of epistemology, was it necessary for Miss Rand to do more than introspect in order to obtain the basic facts? If not, how could she know that her theory is valid for all human beings? Oh, certainly she had to do more than introspect. All she had done was introspect. She wouldn't even know there was a world. Introspection only gives you the data, the content of your own consciousness. She had to do many, many things. She had to observe not only her own consciousness, but how other people's minds operate, how they learn, how they speak, how they use concepts. She had to learn concepts from other people, how she had to learn language. She had to know something about the history of the acquisition of knowledge. In what stages was it acquired? What had to be known before Aristotle could reach his stage? Something about the history of science and so on. She had to know many factual things about the way human beings function. Now, she can't directly inspect another person's consciousness, but she can observe their behavior, and I mean here their cognitive behavior, what they say and write, and in what level and what stages of development, and that is essential. If you simply took the most brilliant child and left him on a desert island to introspect, he would never even get to the stage probably of past one or two words, let alone a theory of concept. Now, if the question is, how do you know that a theory is true for everybody? That's a different question, and I cover that in my course on the theory of knowledge. I mean on the objectivist, what's it called? Philosophy of objectivism. Yes?
So on a different subject, I could see a reason based on the Crow epistemology for the lectures in this course when you're lecturing, passing out an outline, something which lists or summarizes the points covered. Do you have some reason for not?
Well, do I have some reason for not making up an outline and handing it out? Yes, time and money. I have nothing pedagogical against it, but I don't think it's essential, and it might conceivably be helpful, but I try to lecture in such a way that people can take notes if they want to, and there's a limit to what's possible. It would be even easier if I could give a whole transcript. I mean, easier for people to follow, and then they could just stay home and read it, but I'm still doing the transcript from a 1968 course. So. I'll take a few last written questions, and then I think we'll conclude for this evening. There are some that are very far out from this course so far that I don't see that they really can be answered here, so I'll have to refer the questioner to other literature. One in particular on legal philosophy and sanity is not even a philosophic issue. That's philosophy of law, which is a narrow application of philosophy of politics, so it wouldn't even be part of objectivism. But I can't resist on that sheet this question. How would objectivism regard the experiment being conducted wherein female Mensa members are to be artificially inseminated with the sperm of Nobel Prize winners in an attempt to produce offspring of superior intellect? Well, I don't know that objectivism has a viewpoint, because that is a specific experiment, and philosophy can't have a viewpoint on that. I would have a viewpoint. I think that's fantastic. If for no other reason than that I have met female Mensa members, and do not seem to me from their qualifications that that necessarily means a high level of intelligence. It is certainly true that that is not applicable to Nobel Prize winners, and therefore the combination is not very auspicious. Now, if you said more broadly, is intelligence inheritable, and therefore should you breed, what would happen if you breed more intelligent with people with each other? That's a purely scientific question. There's no philosophic means of answering that. It's possible that brain capacity is inherited to some extent. It's also possible that it's, except for certain aberrations, it's depends on how you develop, with what kind of basic ideas you grow up, and that there is no substantial difference between people in terms of their endowment. That's a scientific question. Now, a couple of last ones very briefly, then we'll close up. Can you be an objectivist only sometimes? Well, I mean, if I took this question straight, the answer has to be no. Without a doubt, no, because I can just hear Ms. Rand saying the essence here is consistency of objectivism, starting with certain premises and following them consistently without contradiction and being devoted to logic. So if you are sometimes, that means sometimes you accept certain basic premises and go, really it means sometimes you go by reason and accept reality and pursue your life, and sometimes you don't. Well, if that's the case, you're not anything philosophically. The closest you'd be to being something philosophically is like an existentialist or a pragmatist or whoever it is that goes by, you know, the decision of the moment inconsistently, and one moment he does one thing and one the other. Then you hold no consistent ideas, not even Kantian. You're sort of anti-ideological if you fluctuate on basic fundamentals, and then your philosophy is really pragmatism or emotionalism. But it certainly would not be objectivism. The only thing I could think is, you mean, can you be an objectivist in the sense of what you defend, what you say? It's possible on one day to say objectivist things and the next day to say the opposite. But I don't think you mean that. If you mean be, the answer is no. You couldn't be any consistent philosophy, you know, on one day and then not the next. Like if you're a Kantian, you know, and he was really consistent on that, or a Platonist. If you vacillate, you're not anything, you're a pragmatist. Which is something, but it's something very low. Now the last one, which I'm going to just take in a word, have you and Miss Rand ever had a philosophical disagreement which lasted more than several hours? Yes. It was ultimately resolved, but on several points. At first, I did not understand the objectivist view on a number of different questions, including free will and theory of concepts, and took me many more than several hours, more like several months, and in some cases several years, before I clearly, fully understood why she advocated certain points. Obviously, the more I was able to grasp, the easier and the faster any disagreement was resolved, but certainly at the beginning, several hours was just enough to name what the question was, let alone start on the answer. With that, I will conclude, and we'll meet next time for the last time. Thank you.